Hi, I'm Christine, and I'd like to introduce you to the True Crime Files podcast, a bi-weekly podcast that focuses on mysterious disappearances and unsolved murders. Every 2 weeks, we'll be releasing an episode that'll help you get to know a case really well without having to invest a lot of your time. Derived from the articles up on the True Crime Files website, you'll find that our show covers a diversity of victims and perspectives. You'll probably also notice that our episodes are narrated by Scott Fuller from the Frozen Truth and Status Pending podcasts. Be sure to subscribe to the True Crime Files today so that you never miss an episode. Thanks so much for listening, being a part of our true crime community, and helping to shine a light on cases that might otherwise be overlooked or underreported.
Hi listeners, I'm JT, your host for Crime Trials. We are an investigative true crime podcast examining the depraved minds behind the most heinous acts of malice. If you like documentary-style true crime shows with immersive primary source audio, straight from the courtroom, then we are the show for you. We break down motives, evidence, and legal strategies behind past and current high-profile criminal trials. We take you into the mind of the defendant through direct and expert testimony. We review the pre-trial motions and discuss the most compelling evidence introduced at trial. We also cover the evidence deemed too prejudicial for the jury to hear or consider. We explain the legal arguments behind those decisions and discuss how it might have changed or influenced the verdict. Join us at Crime Trials on your favorite podcast player of your choice.
Hi, it's me, Jackie. Before we get started, I wanted to tell you that this is the first part of a series on Ukraine. It's important to understand that the war in Ukraine didn't start on February 24th, 2022. It goes back centuries. I'm not going to say much about the events of the 10th century, but I will touch on that, and then move forward to the present day. I also want to say that I'm not a historian. I'm a microbiologist. I've done my best to make sense of the history of Ukraine, but if there are errors, please feel free to contact me on Facebook or Twitter so we can talk about it. I'm more than willing to issue corrections. With that, let's get started. Welcome to Cause of Death, 100 Seconds to Midnight. These episodes address the doomsday clock and the events that keep it ticking down, and the things we can do to stop it. The doomsday clock has been set at 100 seconds to midnight since 2020. It's 100 seconds to midnight, and throughout history, Ukraine has fought for their independence against all odds and against several countries. Three things make up the base of a societal culture: their history, their language, and their religion. When another force takes away any one of those things, a culture is lost. The people founder, and their direction becomes wayward. The people of Ukraine have struggled to keep their culture alive for centuries, but several invading forces oppressed them, and bit by bit, over time, their culture was threatened. During the 12th century, Ukrainians were known as Kievan Rus. These people most likely spoke in one of the East Slavic dialects that gave way to modern-day Ukrainian. They had accepted the Eastern Rite Orthodox Church as their religion, and after the Mongols invaded the territory, the Rus people were incorporated into that empire. The princes of Moscow would become the most reliable tax collectors for the Mongols before challenging them and more or less running them out. As long as Kiev remained a part of Russia, the Russians could claim those bloodlines. But as Ukraine began to split off from Russia and become its own nation, taking Kiev with it, those lines began to blur. The Cossacks were originally serfs who had run away from their masters. They made their way to the steppes where they hunted, fished, and kept bees. They also raided Muslim Tatar villages and plundered them. The Tatars made their living by kidnapping people from other villages to be sold into slavery. Eventually, the Lithuanians, who still had control of the region, hired the Cossacks to defend the southern frontier. The Cossacks who agreed to this were put on a registry where they were given the right to own land, they were given tax exemption, and a certain degree of self-government. In 1569, Ukraine became part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth due to Ottoman invasion and wars with the Crimean Tatars. As a result, the Orthodox Church that the Rus claimed had been banned. In 1596, the Polish government allowed the creation of the Uniate Church, which is the Ukrainian Catholic Church today. At the same time that the Polish government allowed the creation of the Uniate Church, Poland had become a major exporter of grain, so needed good land to grow crops on. Ukraine became a prized possession, and Ukrainians were again put into serfdom. To add insult to injury, the landowners, who were Polish Catholic nobles, were often absentee. They would lease the land to other people who were often Jewish, and those people would collect a duty tax from the serfs themselves, thus creating a rift between the serfdom, the Jews, and the Poles. The only thing that allowed any of this to work was defense from the Cossacks, who at least kept the Tatars at bay. By the early 1600s, however, the Cossacks had grown to a legion of 40,000. And they began to recognize that their people were essentially being held in slavery by the nobles. The Cossacks were not only defenders of the Orthodox faith, but they were also defenders of their people. During this period, the Cossacks had organized several uprisings in the area to demand freedom for the Ukrainians who were still being held as serfs. In 1648, they were successful in initiating a peasant war and a national revolution that left the Cossacks in control. This formed the nationalism that most Ukrainians believe in today. They gained their autonomy all those years ago, and they were determined to keep it. It was shortly after that the Cossacks formed an alliance with Russia as a form of protection against other invaders. But this led to Ukraine essentially being absorbed by Russia bit by bit. The Pereyaslav Treaty was signed in 1654. This treaty sealed the reunification of Russia and Ukraine. To this day, this treaty is what Russians refer to when they claim that Ukraine does not have its own national identity. Reunification in this case is defined as the exploitation of Ukraine and the persecution of Ukrainian culture. The Russian Empire had forced Ukrainians to give up their language and speak Russian. So now that I've laid the groundwork for the Ukrainian culture, I'll move forward to the 19th century as the tenuous relationship between Ukraine and Russia becomes obvious. For many years, Ukrainian assimilation was largely ignored by the Russians. Then, in the 1830s, the Polish elite who were living along the Dnipro River decided to rebel against the Russian rule. The Tsarist government proclaimed all this land to be Russian territory, including Little Russia, or Ukraine. By this time, Ukraine had produced intellectuals that were as loyal to Russia as they were to Ukraine. They created art, poetry, and had long discussions on social discourse. By the time the Poles rebelled for the second time, the Tsars decided that not only would they squash the Polish culture, but they would take action against the Ukrainians as well. Better safe than sorry. They banned any educational or religious material written in Ukrainian in order to keep them well out of reach of the peasantry, who only spoke Ukrainian. By 1876, all publications written in Ukrainian were banned. Ukrainian cultural organizations and the press would only be allowed to exist legally between the 1905 revolution and the beginning of World War I. Long enough for Ukrainian intellectuals to reach out to the people, but not nearly long enough to form a cultural identity or a sense of democratic freedom. In 1914, the European empires went to war. This gave Ukrainians in Austria and Galicia a chance to liberate their brethren in Russia from the oppression that they endured under the Tsars. They formed a Ukrainian army within the Austro-Hungarian army. Approximately 28,000 men volunteered for this unit, but only 2,000 were accepted. The war seemed like it would never end, and Ukrainian patriots on both sides of the Eastern Front understood that the defeat of both the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians would be best for Ukraine. At the end of World War I, all the Eastern and Central powers of Europe collapsed. The Allies promoted the rebuilding and reorganization of these countries, with the exception of Ukraine. Ukraine was carved up and distributed as a buffer zone between the Allied nations and the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were only interested in keeping as much of the former Russian territory as they could, while appearing to play nice in the form of federalization, or the appearance of federalization. When the Russian monarchy collapsed in 1917, the Ukrainian national movement saw their chance to raise their voice against Russian rule. Negotiations between the Central Rada, or the Ukrainian Revolutionary Parliament, and the Russian Provisional Government began. These negotiations regarded the division of provinces among the Ukrainian government and the Russian government. The Bolsheviks also declared their stake in Ukraine by introducing the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Several representatives from this entity showed up at the negotiation table to negotiate peace with the Central Powers. Yet, in the same moment, the Bolsheviks were marching on Kyiv. The Germans and the Austrians made their own deals with Russia and Ukraine. They wanted both nations to provide grain to their starving people. In early 1918, the Brest-Litovsk peace was signed. This treaty forced the Bolsheviks to recognize Ukraine as its own independent state along all of its ethnographic borders. So the Bolsheviks had to stay out, but the Germans and the Austrians occupied Ukraine to ensure that the food that they had bargained for was delivered, by force, if necessary. They replaced the leftist